This is gonna be a page to edit because instead of stopping and starting again, I just leave the pauses in. Hello everybody, my name is Vero, this is Vero Reads, and today I have another wrap-up, this time the February wrap-up. I know I did a wrap-up 2 weeks ago, but it was because that one was very late, and I don't want this one to be very late as well. So here's my February wrap-up. The month of February felt really weird reading-wise. Maybe it was because I read a lot at the beginning of the month, and so towards the end of the month I felt like I wasn't reading anything. Or maybe it was because the books I read, even though I read some really good books, they didn't feel personal to me. They didn't feel like a new favorite. I will recommend this to everybody, etc. I don't know. It was a really weird reading month. Not my best. We'll see how March will go. So far it's starting really slow. I haven't read much. But anyway, let's start with the wrap-up. The first book I read was The Black Tulip by Alexandre Dumas. It was written, I think, in 1850, something like that. It's historical fiction set in the 1600s in the Netherlands during the time of the tulipomania. Is that how you say it? Probably not. Tulipomania basically tells of this guy who really doesn't want to do anything around politics, but it's a very turbulent political moment for his country, and he's the godson of a really important political figure, and so he gets trapped in this political intrigue, even though the only thing he wants is to grow the first black tulip that's ever been grown. I read this for my short classics book club because I wanted a taste tester for Dumas. Dumas tends to write doorstoppers, and I really don't like big books, as we all know. And I really wanted to see if I enjoyed Dumas' writing style before I committed to 1,000 pages of The Count of Monte Cristo or 600 pages of The Three Musketeers. And I have to say that I'm glad I read this book because I don't think I will be reading those books. I really did not like the writing style of this book. I get why people like Dumas. He's really good, really good at plotting, at bringing the plot along. Pacing, he's really good at pacing. He's really good at pulling everything together, but that's it. Everything else I did not enjoy. I felt like the writing was so long-winded, really like to the point of being tedious, to the point of saying out loud, why can't you just move along? I don't care. And especially because there were a lot of details, but the details were on stuff that I didn't care about subjectively. Subjectively. I mean, everybody else in the book club felt kind of the same, that it was an okay book. It was a good book to read just so you could say that you read it, but it wasn't really innovative, it wasn't really engaging, it wasn't really exciting. It was an adventure book. I'm thankful for Dumas for his contribution to literature, but I will not be partaking. Thank you very much. By the way, if I feel a bit nasally, it's because I'm still recovering from my flu. The second book I read was Clean by Alia Trabucco Zeran, translated by Sophie Hughes. I read this because of Katya's Reading the Globe challenge. This is a masterfully written book. I could describe this book in one word, which is distressing. It is intense. It is an anxious kind of thrill that it gives you. You're constantly breathless because you're constantly waiting for the tension to be burst and the situation to climax, and it never does until the very end. And that's a hard thing to do, to keep building on tension upon tension upon tension. So it is really masterfully written. And the book talks about this woman who is a live-in maid. Her name is Estela, and she works for a well-off family in Chile, and you have husband, wife, and then a very young daughter. There's a lot of themes. I could talk a lot about this book because it is really packed full with really important things to say. But the thing I'm going to focus on is how painfully accurate the portrayal of a working class person was. Because Estella, the protagonist, is a working class living maid. She has to live in somebody else's house and do their laundry, wash their dishes, iron their shirts, do everything that they ask of them, prepare their food, and be completely removed from them because she needs money to send to her mother back home. It was painfully accurate how she was stuck in this incredibly uncomfortable, incredibly claustrophobic situation, and how she would justify to herself the fact that she was still there, that she did not leave, she did not find something better. And there's a picture being painted in the background of, like, throughout the whole novel, of Chile's political and social environment, how it's a very unstable situation. So we kind of get a glimpse of a bigger context of why she feels like she needs to endure something that's really inhuman, even though nothing, nothing bad happens to this woman. Within her job, nothing extremely harrowing happens, but it feels like she's being tortured just by the environment she's in. And not only her employers as well, just by the social constraint of this situation and the social norms and the psychological power dynamics that are inherent to this situation. It feels like she's being tortured, her and everybody in the house she's working in. But also you can see why she's still there, and you can see why she should go, and you can see how she could go if she really could bring herself to do it, but she can't. That's a hard thing to do. That's a hard thing to do, because if you're talking to your friend in real life and they're telling you, my job sucks, I need to leave, and you say to them, yes, you need to leave, and they say, but I'm not gonna leave, you're like, that happens. And this book really captures that. And it's something that I've experienced, something that a lot of people that I know have experienced, because, when you are from that background, you think those things and you feel those things and you feel that sense of entrapment that is in some part brought on by yourself. It is, taught to you, but it is also brought onto yourself by yourself. But anyway, that was really, really good. There's a lot of other things happening. Like, this book really is a window on human nature. So I would really recommend, if you're okay, if you're doing fine and you're okay with handling a very intense situation, or if you need to feel validated because your job sucks but you feel like you cannot leave it, I highly recommend it, but with some if you're in the right headspace for it. Next, I read Narc from NetGalley. That's called The River Has Roots by Amal El-Mohtar. Amal El-Mohtar, I don't know if you recognize the name, was one of the co-writers of This Is How You Lose the Time War. And you can tell this book is really, really short, so I'm not going to go into the plot. The vibes are traditionally folk fairy tale with a lot of metamorphosis, transformation, sisterly bond, queer rap, natural elements, a grammar-based magic system where language, song, and poetry allow you to cast spells and transform things and save yourself from the most dire circumstances. And also, of course, love that transcends all time and space. And the language of it really gives This Is How You Lose the Time War. It's a really flowery language, all the enchanted language of This Is How You Lose the Time War, and all of the, larger than life love story. So I highly recommend it. It is really, really short, but it gives a lot. Next, I read White Tears, Brown Scars by Ruby Hamad. I listened to it on audiobook. narrated by Mojan Marno. Very good narrator. I had this book on my digital TBR for a really long time, and I'm really glad that I finally got around to it. I love that it had a lot of historical research and facts. It wasn't just an opinion, and that it put into words something that I see happen a lot. I see happen constantly, but I'd never had the words to describe. And this book really showed the impact of being able to identify something, define it, and in so doing, being able to fight it better. It talks about the phenomenon of white tears, especially white woman tears, which is when a white woman is getting called out because she's being racist or she's being something else, and she plays victim and she cries and she brings the attention to her feeling attacked, her feeling like she did something wrong and now she feels bad and she feels guilty, but everybody's angry at her, instead of the person of color that's trying to say, listen, you hurt me first, and in a broader way, in a more systemically is an issue way, and how usually white women are rewarded because the system really doesn't want to focus on issues of systemic racism and would much prefer to once again dismiss the complaints of a person of color and instead target them as the issue. It talks about, of course, intersectionality, about the fact that especially within the feminist struggle, there's really need to be a consciousness of intersectional issues in order to be effective, but also ethical. Yeah, I highly recommend it. It is a really good tool when you want to explain to certain people why what they're doing is wrong and what they should do instead, and how they can do better and why they should do better. So yeah, I highly recommend it. After that, I read Frankenstein in Baghdad by Hamed Sadawi. I got this from the library. This book is set in Baghdad in 2005, 2 years after the US invasion of Iraq. And it talks of how Baghdad as a city is completely butchered by war. It's kind of like the opposite of Clean, because Clean was a very mundane situation of a living maid doing a regular job that felt so oppressive and so violent, whereas this is an incredibly oppressive and violent situation that's described in very mild tones. There's a lot of hilarity. It's a slice of life, of a life that's utterly inconceivable in its violence. It feels like it is desensitized to its own violence, and I to me that was intentional. It has a great conversation on victimhood, on becoming the monster that you're fighting, the senseless reality of war. In terms of plot, it talks about Hadi. He's a junk dealer in Baghdad, and he's had, like everybody, a really hard time during this war. He has lost his best friend, and because he lost him in a bombing, he didn't even have his remains to bury properly. And so he gets it into his head to go around the city and gather the body parts of a lot of victims of bombings, sew them together, patch them together to form a whole corpse. Hence the title of Frankenstein in Baghdad. He doesn't even know why himself. Maybe he wants to have somebody, a whole corpse to bury, to give respect to all the people that have died in these bombings. Or maybe he wants to put it in front of the embassy and just showcase the destruction that the military invasion has brought. Or I don't know, maybe he just wants to give some sense to the senseless violence that he's seeing. But when he finally finishes the corpse, the next day he finds that the creature has left. He doesn't know how or why, but he starts hearing reports in the next few days of this hideous man going around and killing people and bringing just people to justice. And it turns out that it's the what's its name, that because of a series of events, gets the soul of a victim of a bombing, and decides that in order to fulfill his purpose, he needs to enact justice and revenge on everybody who has killed each one of his body parts. There's a lot of meat to this novel. It's really well written. I highly recommend it to anybody, especially now, because there's a lot of conversations about how an invading power turns the people of a community against each other, and how in order to fight a occupying power, you end up becoming a violent person yourself and being labeled as a terrorist as well. So there's a lot of really important conversations on war, and especially on war by an occupying power. I enjoyed it. I found it incredibly interesting, incredibly fascinating, incredibly well written. Not particularly enjoyable because, again, unfortunately, it is too topical and too relevant nowadays to just be a story. But you should read it. You should really read it. It's amazing. After that, because I had read a couple of really intense novels one after the other, I just wanted something chill and easy peasy lemon squeezy, and so I finally read Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldry. Legends and Latte is a cozy fantasy. I don't know if it was the first cozy fantasy, but I think it was the first book marketed as a cozy fantasy. It is set in a D&D medieval fantasy world where our protagonist is an orc called Viv that was an adventurer for a long time and now has decided to retire and to open up a coffee shop. Coffee apparently is this really foreign thing, exotic thing from the gnomes. Nobody knows what coffee is. Everybody knows about tea, but nobody knows what coffee is. And she found it once on her travels in a gnomish town and has decided to bring it to a classic medieval England township that really doesn't know what coffee is. The thing I like the most about this book was when they were setting up the cafe, because it felt like watching a renovation video on YouTube. It was really satisfying, and I love problem solving, and I love just seeing something being built. Everything else was, what was written on the tin, very low stakes, very basic plot. The thing I really didn't like about this book is that it was basically like gentrification in a book. So you have this character that has nothing to do with coffee, just gets it, thinks that she can do a proper job with, brewing it, it's not like she spent 6 months, a year trying to understand the art of coffee making, etc. No, she just she buys a coffee machine from the gnomes. She buys the coffee from the gnomes, then she brews it to the best of her abilities, and then serves coffee, and she's immediately successful because coffee is a new thing, and because she makes it sound very, very fancy but at the same time approachable. I don't know, it really felt like Starbucks in the fantasy world. They didn't even come up with fantasy names, where usually you have, airplanes, but they're not called airplanes. They're called something else, fantasy name airplane. No, the coffee is called a latte. Why is it called a latte in this fantasy world? Because there was a gnome called Latte. That's it. And I don't know, maybe it's because I'm Italian, maybe because it's really lazy writing, I don't know. But it was enjoyable. I wanna point out, it was really enjoyable. But it really did feel like the lowest effort possible in world building. Because even imagine if coffee was something that was orcish. Viv is an orc. It was from her culture, from her background. And orcs throughout the novel, but also in general in the medium of Dungeons and Dragons fantasy, Lord of the Rings fantasy, are seen as these brutish, violent creatures. But then imagine if she wanted to share this really cozy, this really warming, restoring part of her culture with the world. And people maybe being like, this cannot be orcish. It's too, nice. It's too cozy. It's too comfortable to be an orcish beverage. And she would have to fight that stereotype and teach people that no, just because we are strong people and we are good in battle doesn't mean that that's all our culture is, all our beings is. I would have preferred that a lot. But I get that it was just meant to be a nice, cozy book. It wasn't meant to be doing that much. Once again, it wasn't a bad book. I would recommend it if you're in the mood for something really nice, simple, that's just there to read a nice story. But it could have been so much more. But it wasn't. And that's fine. If you want a cozy fantasy that's a bit more, like where the world building is a bit more interesting and flavorful, I recommend The Teller of Small Fortunes by Julie Leong. It is maybe a bit less cozy than Legends and Lattes, but a bit more interesting. And then lastly, I read a poetry collection called Other People's Comfort Keeps Me Up at Night by Morgan Parker. I got this from the library. I think this was her debut poetry collection. I'm not sure. I really, really liked all the pop culture references. Some people sometimes use pop culture references as an Easter egg, as being like, hey, you got this. Whereas this really felt like the pop culture references were being used to show the culture of the time. Talking about the Real Housewives of New York is not just a cool Easter egg inside joke with the reader, oh, this is topical, everybody knows. It is really saying our generation has been brought up by the Real Housewives of New York. Broadly speaking, this is a generation that has been brought up by the Kardashians, has been brought up by Jay-Z and Beyonce. And these are things that shape us as people as much as climate change, as much as global politics and religion and everything else. So I really loved how it was able to use these pop culture references to say media is more important than a lot of other things nowadays. Media is the religion of modern culture. It was a really fun thing to see. In terms of the actual poems themselves, there were some I liked best, some I liked less, but I don't know enough about poetry to actually know if my opinions are correct when it comes to subjectively thinking a poem might be better than another one. In general, I really like the voice of the poet, and I would recommend her maybe to somebody who knows more about poetry so they can tell me. I do this all the time whenever I'm reaching to a new genre or a new literary context or anything. I always want to hear an expert on it, not because I might agree with what they say, but just because I want to know what the vibe is in terms of what is the consensus on what makes a good poetry collection. And I know there's never a consensus in literature, but I just want to know the critical reception so I can decide if I agree or if I disagree and why. But anyway, these were the books that I read in February. Thank you so much for listening. Let me know if you've read any of this and what did you think. As I said, it wasn't a really satisfying reading month. I'm having high hopes for March. I'm hoping that March will be a bit better, a bit more exciting. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for watching. And I will see you next time. Bye-bye.